Fear. I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, but fear is one of the great industries of our time. Maybe more precisely, what I want to say is that the promotion of fear has become one of the great industries of our time. Maybe even that's not exactly precise, because promoting fear has always been a big-time industry. Sometimes I, taking my words from Paul in some of his letters in the New Testament, speak of the principalities and powers, not as demonic spiritual beings necessarily, but as the everyday institutions that can take control of our lives and that set themselves up in place of God for us in one way or another. And there are a lot of principalities and powers. And most of them try to function on the basis of fear. They want us to be afraid, because fear draws our attention away from God. Unfortunately, maybe you'd even be surprised to hear this, one of those principalities and powers, I suspect, is sometimes at least the church. Because historically, the church itself has often been guilty of promoting fear. The church has often tried to scare people with threats of hell and damnation, frighten them into the kingdom, so to speak, establishing control by making people afraid, rather than emphasizing the divine love and the grace that Jesus emphasized during his own ministry. When I met with a family a little while ago regarding a recent funeral, and I talked to them about what they wanted in the service, what they wanted to hear, what they thought they needed to hear, one of the first things they said, interestingly enough, as a matter of fact, not one of the first things, I believe the first thing they said when I asked them about the service was, "Please, no hell and damnation preaching." And I thought that was an interesting response, because obviously somewhere along the way they had been exposed to that strategy, which is a strategy of the principalities and powers, promoting fear, trying to control people by making them afraid. Well, if Christians believe that God is love, and if we trust the scripture that says that the Spirit of God is not a spirit of fear, then why Christians would think it's appropriate to consider resorting to fear as a means of spreading good news is a mystery to me. But it goes beyond the church. There are a lot of principalities and powers that inhabit our world that try to scare us. I've been doing a lot of reflecting on this since a couple of days before Christmas, but in a way, the whole insurance industry is built on the basis of fear, isn't it? What might happen if we don't have it? I'm not saying that insurance is evil or that it's bad to have. We're actually rather grateful, aren't we, Lynn, at this point? But still, it's there to promote fear. What might happen if you don't have it? Governments, politics in general, it works too often on the basis of fear. Scare people. Maybe we can get them to vote for us by scaring them about what will happen if they vote for the other guys. Happens all the time. The response to 9/11 years ago now hinged on the promotion of fear, as people were convinced that they had to give up more and more of their rights and more of their privacy in order to be secure. I've always appreciated the wisdom of Benjamin Franklin, who said, "Those who give up essential liberty to obtain temporary security deserve neither liberty nor security." But it was all on the basis of fear. I remember a few years ago a TV commercial suggesting that if Stephen Harper were ever elected, there would be troops in the streets. I haven't seen the troops yet, but it was a play on fear. And the whole law and order agenda that's so popular today implicitly suggests that crime is out of control and that we're in danger, in spite of the fact that virtually every measurable statistic says that crime, and especially violent crime, is in decline. But fear works. It convinces us to be more and more compliant to those who promise to protect us from the things that they've been able to make us afraid of. And when fear, rather than faith, becomes the dominant force in a person's life, well, that's a very sad thing indeed. The Bible suggests that fear should not be the characteristic of a life of faith. Psalm 27, verse 1, which Chris read for us earlier, tells us, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" And the obvious answer is that we shouldn't be afraid, that as people of faith, we should never succumb to the fear that so many want to plant within us. But fear can be a powerful thing. It can take us over. It can take possession of us. And when fear possesses us, we stop being the church because we start to play things safe, always safe. When fear possesses us, we start to put ourselves and our own well-being and our own survival above everything else, which is, of course, a denial of the example of the one we supposedly follow, Jesus. He didn't exactly embrace the hardships that he faced, and he certainly didn't embrace death. We're told that he cried tears in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before his arrest. But he had faith. He lived in a close and intimate relationship with his Father that assured him that as much as he didn't embrace what he was called to do, which was nothing less than his own death, he nevertheless accepted that this was what God was asking of him. And he didn't act in fear. He acted with faith. He understood the words of the author of Psalm 27, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Of whom shall I be afraid? Jesus understood that with God, there truly is nothing to fear, which perhaps explains, as I've mentioned many times, why he could repeatedly say to his disciples over and over and over again, "Do not be afraid." Don't ever be afraid, Jesus said. Do not be afraid. The words sound strange in some ways, considering how prevalent fear is in our society, considering how many there are who try to convince us over and over again that we should, in fact, be afraid. And frankly, 2,000 years ago, there was no less reason to be afraid. In fact, there probably was more reason to be afraid 2,000 years ago, afraid of a lot of things. Jesus lived in a society in which tyrants were rampant and there was really little way to control them. And yet, in the face of all that, Jesus was still able to say over and over and over again, "Do not be afraid." In the face of life and in the face of death, in the face of hatred and in the face of persecution, in the face of trial and even ultimately in the face of execution, Jesus could say, "Do not be afraid. Never fear." It's strange. It's good news, but it's strange good news. Because in the midst of a world that so often seems so frightening, and in which there seem to be so many reasons to be afraid, and into lives that are so often filled with fear, Jesus still continues to say, "Do not be afraid." Do not be afraid. Why shouldn't we be afraid? Why shouldn't we be afraid? What's the problem with fear? Jesus understood that fear stops us from living, from truly living. Jesus wanted his disciples to have true life, abundant life, he said. And you can't have that if you're living in fear. If you let the principalities and powers tell you that there's always something to be afraid of, so you need to give up more and more and more of the things that make life truly vibrant and truly abundant. If you do that, you're not going to live. And that's what fear does. By telling people not to be afraid in a world that so often seems to be filled with fear, Jesus is telling his disciples that they are to have a deep and radical and powerful faith in God. A faith so powerful that it almost makes no sense. Because it should be a faith that stands firm in any circumstances, a faith that cannot be shaken, a faith that fear cannot take away. A faith that sustained Jesus as he faced the cross, or Peter and Paul and Stephen and other early disciples as they faced execution, or the early church as it faced severe persecution, or the church today in parts of the world where it still faces severe persecution, and yet continues on in the face of it. While so much of the church in the Western world, where it's so easy and so convenient to be a Christian, seems lost in despair, and often succumbs to fear, feeling little hope for the future. What's wrong, I wonder, with Christianity in the Western world that we so often fall in the face of fear, and we look at the future as something to be afraid of rather than as an opportunity? I wonder what's wrong with us. It seems to me that we, as 21st century Western Christians, would do well to learn some lessons from our Christian forebears and from our contemporaries who fight for their very existence on a daily basis and who never give up. We, as 21st century Western Christians, would do well to listen to Jesus as we face what we perceive to be our struggles. Remember Jesus, the one who died on a cross, and we think we have struggles. And yet Jesus could say, do not be afraid. Don't face the future. Don't face the world with fear. Face it with faith. Because faith will overcome fear every time if we let it. So implicitly, when Jesus says, do not be afraid, I think what he's really saying is just do what God is calling you to do, and even if you die doing it, what's the big deal? So did I, and I came back. What is there to be afraid of when your life is filled with faith? The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? The answer is, there is no one and nothing to fear when God is with you. And the good news is that God is with us always. Praise be to God.